He came to the mountains to outrun memories that had the persistence of shadows, clinging to him longest in the quiet hours just before dawn. Jonathan Cole, late of the United States Navy SEALs, had traded the salt-laced air of Coronado for the pine-sharp scent of the Pacific Northwest. He had sought a silence deep enough to drown the echoes of a single, catastrophic decision made in the dust and chaos of a forgotten war. The silence he found, however, was different. It was not empty. It had teeth. It watched him from the dense stands of Douglas fir and listened from the cold, clear depths of the lake his small cabin overlooked. His cabin was a simple, unadorned box of cedar and glass, a testament to function over comfort. It was a forward operating base in his personal war against the past. He lived a life pared down to essentials: a cot, a single cast-iron skillet, a wood stove, and a stack of books on botany and geology he never seemed to read. His days were measured by the rising and setting of the sun, his movements governed by a discipline that had been forged in crucibles of unimaginable pressure. It was the only way he knew how to live. Without the structure of routine, he feared the carefully constructed walls of his solitude would collapse, leaving him exposed to the grief he kept chained in the cellar of his soul. He wore the same uniform every day, a second skin that was both armor and penance. A faded olive M65 field jacket, its liner buttoned in against the perpetual damp, a rotation of identical plaid flannel shirts, worn cargo pants with pockets that remained stubbornly empty, and a pair of scuffed leather boots that had molded to the shape of his feet and his sorrow. On his wrist, a military-issue CWC diver's watch, its tritium markers long since faded, kept time with relentless, unforgiving clicks. It was the same watch he had worn then. He never took it off. It was his reminder, his anchor to the moment everything went wrong. He was not entirely alone in his exile. At his side, always, was Czar. The German shepherd was as much a veteran as John was, a former military working dog whose service record was longer and, in some ways, more distinguished than his own. Czar was old now. The fur around his magnificent black muzzle had turned a dignified silver gray, and his hips sometimes bothered him on cold mornings. But his eyes, two chips of intelligent amber, missed nothing. They held the same quiet vigilance that John felt in his own bones. Czar was not a pet. He was a partner, the last remaining member of his team. Their communication was a silent language of shared glances, subtle shifts in weight, and the almost imperceptible tensing of a muscle. The dog was his early warning system, his confidant, his four-legged conscience. They had a morning ritual. John would rise before the sun, the cold floorboards a shock to his system. He would start the fire in the wood stove, the scrape of the match and the whoosh of the kindling catching fire, the only sounds in the world. While the coffee percolated, he would stand on the small porch, breathing in the damp, earthy air. Czar would sit beside him, not touching but close enough for John to feel the heat radiating from his body. They would watch the mist burn off the lake, the surface of the water like hammered pewter in the pre-dawn light. It was in these moments that John felt something akin to peace, a temporary ceasefire in his internal conflict. One particular morning in late October, the air held a different quality. It was colder, sharper, carrying the promise of the first snow. A stillness had fallen over the forest, a profound hush that seemed to make the very mountains hold their breath. John felt it as a pressure against his skin. Czar felt it too. The dog, normally a statue of calm, was restless. He paced the length of the short porch, his claws making soft, scraping sounds on the wood. His head was up, his ears swiveling, sampling the air for a threat John could not yet perceive. "Easy, boy," John murmured, his voice a low rumble. He rested a hand on the dog's powerful neck, feeling the tension coiled there. Czar did not relax. He whined, a low, guttural sound of deep unease that he rarely ever made. He looked up at John, his amber eyes insistent, then turned his head sharply toward the dense, trackless forest that rose up the slope behind the cabin. John trusted the dog's instincts implicitly. He had trusted them in the labyrinthine alleys of Fallujah and the treacherous mountain passes of the Hindu Kush. Czar's senses were an extension of his own, finer, more attuned to the subtle dissonances of the natural world. If Czar said something was wrong, it was wrong. John went back inside, his movements economical and precise. He pulled on his boots, lacing them tight. He shrugged on his field jacket and clipped a folding knife into his pocket. He grabbed his Eberly stock half-track backpack, its familiar weight a comfort on his shoulders. Inside was everything he needed to survive for 72 hours: water, rations, a medical kit, a compass, and a map. He never went anywhere without it. When he stepped back onto the porch, Czar was waiting, a black and silver statue of purpose. The dog gave a single sharp bark and then, without waiting for a command, trotted off the porch and into the tree line. He moved with a deliberation that John had not seen in years, the stiffness in his hips forgotten. This was not a chase. This was an investigation. John followed, the soft bed of pine needles silencing his footfalls. The forest enveloped them, the tall firs and ancient cedars blocking out the nascent light, plunging them into a world of green and gray shadow. They climbed for nearly an hour, Czar leading the way with unwavering certainty. The dog did not bound or zigzag. He moved on a direct bearing, his nose sometimes to the ground, sometimes lifted to the air. John followed, his eyes scanning, his senses on high alert. He fell back into the old rhythms, the muscle memory of a lifetime spent moving through hostile territory. He noted the broken twigs, the direction of the wind, the panicked flight of a small bird. Everything was a piece of a puzzle he did not yet understand. Paragraph-paragraph. The air grew colder, heavier. A strange smell reached him, cutting through the scent of pine and damp earth. It was the smell of rust and decay, of old oil and stagnant water. It was a smell that did not belong here, miles from any road, high on a mountain slope that was charted as nothing but wilderness. Czar stopped. He stood over a patch of moss-covered ground, his body rigid, a low growl vibrating in his chest. His hackles were raised, a clear and unambiguous signal of a major anomaly. "What is it?" John asked, his voice barely a whisper. He approached slowly, his hand resting on the dog's back to calm him. Czar's growl subsided, but his body remained as tense as a drawn bowstring. He lowered his head and began to paw at the moss, his movements careful, deliberate. He was not digging frantically. He was uncovering something. After a moment, his paw scraped against something hard, something metallic. John knelt beside him. He pulled a small entrenching tool from his pack and began to carefully clear the earth and moss away. The metallic object was a flat, rusted plate. As he cleared more of it, he saw letters, faint but still legible, stamped into the steel. M.Y. Serenity. Below it, a home port. Monaco. John froze. A motor yacht. Here. It was impossible. He was hundreds of miles from the coast, thousands of feet above sea level. It made no sense. It was a tear in the fabric of reality. Czar nudged his hand, then moved a few feet away and began pawing at another spot. John followed, a knot of cold dread and burning curiosity tightening in his gut. He dug again. This time, he uncovered not a plate, but a thick, braided steel cable, a mooring line, impossibly large and impossibly out of place. It snaked away from them, disappearing into the earth under the vast root system of an ancient cedar. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed a ghost. John stood up, his mind racing, trying to process the absurdity of it. He looked around, his trained eyes reevaluating the landscape. He had walked these woods for months, had seen them as nothing more than trees and rock. Now he saw them differently. The ground was not even. There was a subtle, unnatural contour, a long, linear depression and rise that he had previously dismissed as a geological feature. It was nearly 100 yards long, a massive, elongated shape hidden beneath a century of forest growth. He walked the length of it, Czar trotting silently beside him. It was the distinct outline of a ship's hull, a very large ship. He could feel the sheer, massive presence of it under his feet. He reached the end of the shape and saw what he had mistaken for a rock outcropping. It was not rock. It was a colossal bronze propeller, green with verdigris, half buried in the earth, its blades twisted and bent as if by some titanic force. He placed a hand on the cold metal. The scale of it was staggering. This was not a pleasure boat. This was a super yacht, a vessel of immense size and luxury from another era, resting in a grave of soil and trees. How? The question hammered at him. A tsunami? A flood of biblical proportions? There was no geological evidence of such an event, no record, no story. It was simply here, a silent, colossal impossibility. Czar whined again, drawing John's attention. The dog was standing near what John now recognized as the stern. He was looking at a specific point where the earth had been disturbed more recently. A small landslide, perhaps from the spring thaw, had exposed a section of the hull. John scrambled down the muddy slope. Here the steel was less corroded. He could see a dark, rectangular shape set into the hull. A door. A watertight hatch, its locking wheel still in place. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down John's spine. This was more than just a wreck. A wreck was an accident, a tragedy of physics and misfortune. This felt different. The mooring line, the careful way it was buried. It felt intentional. The ship hadn't just crashed here. It had been brought here. Hidden. Forgotten. He looked at the locking wheel on the hatch. It was designed to be opened. For a moment, the old instincts warred with his desire for isolation. One voice, the voice of the operator, told him to document, report, and withdraw. This was an unknown, a potential hazard. The other voice, the one he had been trying to silence for years, was the voice of the man who had left a partner behind. It was a voice that whispered of unfinished business, of secrets that demanded to be known. Leaving now felt like a familiar failure, another retreat. He looked down at Czar. The dog was watching him, his head cocked, his amber eyes seeming to understand the conflict raging inside him. The dog's presence was a grounding force. He was not just a dog. He was a promise that John had made to himself to never again abandon a partner. And in that moment, the silent, rusting hulk of the yacht felt like a partner of a different kind, a vessel carrying a story that had been left for dead. He put his hands on the cold steel of the locking wheel. It was frozen with rust. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. He braced his feet and pulled. The metal groaned in protest, a sound that echoed through the silent forest. It didn't budge. He pulled again, his muscles straining, the discipline of years of training focusing his strength into a single, explosive effort. With a screech of tortured metal, the wheel turned. Just an inch. But it was enough. It took him the better part of an hour, working methodically, using a small pry bar from his pack to gain leverage. Sweat soaked the collar of his shirt despite the cold. Each turn of the wheel was a victory, each groan of the metal a sign that the past was relinquishing its grip. Finally, with a loud, resonant clang, the locking dogs disengaged. The heavy steel hatch swung inward a few inches, releasing a gust of stale, cold air that smelled of dust, mildew, and something else. Something that smelled like old paper and dried ink. He pushed the hatch open. Inside was not the flooded, decaying ruin he had expected. It was a dark, cavernous space, and it was perfectly, impossibly, dry. He clicked on the small tactical flashlight from his jacket pocket. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a corridor. The walls were paneled in a dark, polished wood, teak or mahogany, now filmed with a fine layer of dust but otherwise intact. Brass fixtures, tarnished but not corroded, gleamed dully in the light. He had stepped out of the forest and into a time capsule. Czar refused to enter. He stood at the threshold, one paw raised, and let out a soft, low whine. It was not a warning of danger, but something else. A sound of reverence, of respect. John understood. This was a tomb of sorts, and it demanded to be treated as such. "Stay here. Watch," he commanded softly. The dog sat, his silhouette framed against the gray light of the forest, a sentinel at the gates of the past. John stepped inside. The heavy hatch swung shut behind him with a deep, final boom that echoed through the ship, plunging him into absolute darkness and silence. For a heart-stopping second, panic flared in his chest. The old memory, the one he ran from, pressed forward. The sound of a steel door slamming shut. The sudden darkness. The shouting that was cut off mid-syllable. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hand instinctively going to the cold metal of his watch. He forced himself to breathe. In. Out. The panic receded, beaten back by the iron will he had spent a lifetime forging. He was not trapped. He had a light. He had a way out. This was different. He opened his eyes and swept the flashlight beam down the corridor. It was a main companionway, wide and surprisingly grand. Doors lined either side, their brass nameplates still legible. Captain's quarters. Chart room. Main salon. It was like a ghost ship, preserved perfectly in its earthen grave. Dust motes danced in the beam of his light, the only movement in this silent world. The floor was carpeted, the thick pile crunching softly under his boots. He tried the door to the captain's quarters. It was unlocked. He pushed it open and swept the light across the room. A large bunk, its woolen blanket neatly folded. A desk with a leather-bound logbook lying open. A heavy wool naval coat hanging from a brass hook. It was as if the captain had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any second. John approached the desk. He shone the light on the logbook. The last entry was dated June 4th, 1947. The handwriting was a neat, precise cursive. June 4th, 1947. All systems secure. Final preparations complete. The land is ours, but the cost is a debt we can never repay. May God forgive us for what we are burying here. The Serenity is now a vault, a promise, a witness. A witness to what? John's heart hammered against his ribs. This was no accident. This was a deliberate act. Someone had sailed this colossal vessel inland, or more likely, built a basin, floated it in, and then drained the water, burying it as a massive steel safe. The sheer engineering and resources required were mind-boggling, and it had been done in secret. He left the captain's quarters and moved deeper into the ship. He passed a grand staircase, its carved banister thick with dust, that led down into the blackness. He stayed on the main deck, moving toward what the signs indicated was the main salon. The double doors were magnificent, inlaid with mother-of-pearl. He pushed them open, and his light spilled into a cavernous room. The main salon was a scene of frozen elegance. Velvet-upholstered couches and armchairs were arranged in conversational groupings. A grand piano stood in one corner, its lid closed. Crystal decanters sat on a mahogany bar, their contents long since evaporated. But it was the center of the room that drew his attention. Arranged on the floor, in neat, orderly rows, were dozens of metal footlockers. Standard-issue military trunks, the kind he had been issued himself 20 years ago. They were stenciled with family names and serial numbers. And on the far wall, hanging above a cold stone fireplace, was a large, framed map. It was a topographical map of this very region, the mountains and valleys he had come to know so well. But it was different. Dotted across the map were dozens of small, hand-drawn squares, each one labeled with a name: Miller, Thompson, Garcia, Esposito. He recognized some of them from the footlockers. His light found the location of his own cabin on the shore of the lake. On this map, it was not an empty plot of land. It was labeled Miller Homestead, 120 acres. A cold realization washed over him. He was not living in wilderness. He was living on someone's land. Everyone who thought they lived in untouched nature was living on land that had once belonged to these families. He moved closer to the map. Overlaid on the homestead plots, drawn in a stark red grease pencil, were new boundary lines. They carved up the valley, creating a single massive parcel of land. A stamp in the corner of the map read, Columbia River Basin Reclamation Project, Confidential, Property Acquisition Map, Phase 1. He understood. This wasn't just a reclamation project. This was a land seizure. The government, or some powerful entity acting in its name, had taken this entire valley. But why? And what had happened to the families? The footlockers held the answer. He knelt beside the nearest one, its name stenciled in white, Garcia. The latches were stiff but not locked. He pried one open. The hinges creaked like a coffin lid. Inside there was no treasure. There were no valuables. It was filled with personal effects. A stack of faded photographs of a young family standing in front of a modest farmhouse, a child's worn teddy bear, a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, a family Bible, its cover worn smooth with use. And on top of it all, a single folded document. It was a deed to 80 acres of land, signed and dated 1946. Attached to it was another document. A voluntary relocation agreement. It was signed by a member of the Garcia family, but the signature was shaky, forced. And the payment for 80 acres of prime farmland? $1. He opened another trunk. Thompson. The same story. Photos, keepsakes, a deed, and a relocation agreement for $1. He moved through the salon, a grim archaeologist unearthing a forgotten tragedy. Each trunk was a time capsule of a displaced life, a family erased from the map. These were not the belongings of people who had left willingly. These were the things you grab when you are told you have 1 hour to pack before the bulldozers arrive. He realized what the ship was. It was an ark. Not an ark of salvation, but an ark of memory. Whoever the captain was, whoever had orchestrated this, they had not been a party to the injustice. They had been its chronicler. They had gathered the belongings of the displaced families, their stories, their proof of existence, and sealed it all away in this steel tomb. A witness buried in the earth, waiting for a time when the truth could be told. The logbook entry echoed in his mind. May God forgive us for what we are burying here. He spent another hour moving through the ship, his light cutting through the silent, dusty darkness. He found the engine room, the massive diesel engines cold and silent, monuments to a forgotten journey. He found the galley, its stainless steel surfaces gleaming, cans of food still neatly stacked on shelves, their labels faded to illegibility. Everything was orderly. Everything was deliberate. This ship was a statement, a protest, a secret kept for over 70 years. As he made his way back toward the hatch, his light caught something he had missed before. Next to the door of the chart room, mounted on the wall, was a glass case. Inside, cushioned on a bed of faded blue velvet, was a single object. It was a silver railroad spike, tarnished with age. Below it, a small brass plaque was engraved with a single date, May 10th, 1869, Promontory Summit. The date the first transcontinental railroad was completed. It made no sense. What was a golden spike or a silver one doing on a yacht buried in a forest? He felt a sudden, urgent need for air, for light. The weight of the silence and the stories contained within it was suffocating. He pushed open the heavy hatch and stumbled out into the gray afternoon. The world outside seemed impossibly loud, impossibly bright after the tomb-like quiet of the ship. Czar was there, sitting exactly where he had left him, a patient, unwavering sentinel. The dog stood up and nuded John's hand with his cold nose, a silent question. "It's a graveyard, boy," John said, his voice hoarse. He slid down to sit on the damp ground, his back against the cold steel hull of the Serenity. He pulled out his map and compass. He knew what he had to do. The silence he had sought in these mountains was a lie, a carefully constructed illusion built on a foundation of forgotten lives. To honor that silence now, to walk away, would be the ultimate betrayal. It would be a repetition of the past, another failure to act, another partner left behind. He could not do it. His exile was over. The nearest town was a place called North Haven, a small logging community clinging to the side of the highway an hour's drive from the trailhead. It was a town that time seemed to have largely forgotten, its main street lined with brick buildings from the 1940s. John drove his old, beat-up truck into town the next morning, Czar sitting in the passenger seat, his head held high as if he were co-piloting a Black Hawk. John felt exposed, vulnerable. He had avoided towns, avoided people for so long. The casual noise of a passing car, the murmur of conversation from a diner, felt like an assault on his senses. He parked in front of the county courthouse, a stern granite building with a flagpole out front, the flag hanging limp in the still air. He had a plan, a simple one. Start with the land. Start with the official record. He left Czar in the truck with the windows cracked, earning him a look of deep, professional disapproval from the dog. He walked up the steps and into the building. It smelled of floor wax and old paper, the universal scent of bureaucracy. The county clerk's office was a small room lined with massive, leather-bound plat books. Behind a tall wooden counter stood a woman who seemed as solid and enduring as the building itself. She was in her late 50s, tall and spare, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes, magnified by a pair of reading glasses perched on her nose, were sharp and intelligent. Her nameplate read, Margaret Finch, County Clerk. She was the archetypal gatekeeper. She looked up as he approached, her gaze taking in his field jacket, his worn boots, his guarded posture. Her expression was neutral, neither friendly nor hostile. "Can I help you?" Her voice was crisp, no nonsense. "I'm looking for historical property records," John said, his voice feeling rusty from disuse. "For the area around Whisper Lake." Margaret Finch raised an eyebrow. "That's all federal land, national forest. Has been since the late 40s. There are no private holdings up there." "I'm looking for the records from before it was federal land," John clarified. "From, say, 1945 to 1947. Her gaze sharpened. She studied him for a long moment, a flicker of something, curiosity, suspicion in her eyes. That's a long time ago. Those books are in the archives. What's your interest? John had prepared for this. I'm a historian. Amateur, he added, a small lie to make his story more palatable. Researching settlement patterns in the basin before the dam projects. It was a plausible enough explanation. Margaret considered it, her fingers tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm on the counter. She seemed to be weighing him, measuring his sincerity. Finally, she gave a curt nod. The archive room is in the basement. I'll have to escort you. The books are fragile. She came around the counter, a ring of old brass keys jangling at her hip. She moved with a stiff, efficient grace. She led him down a narrow flight of stairs to a dimly lit basement room. The air was cool and dry, and the smell of old paper was even stronger here. Shelves from floor to ceiling were filled with massive, dusty ledgers. The plat books for that period are over here, she said, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. You can look, but no pens. Pencil and paper only, and handle them with care. She gestured to a small wooden table and a single chair under a bare light bulb. She did not leave. She stood by the door, arms crossed, watching him. John felt her eyes on him as he heaved the heavy 1946 ledger onto the table and opened it. The pages were brittle, the ink faded. He found the section for the Whisper Lake Basin, and there it was, in black and white. The map from the yacht brought to life in official, legal detail. Dozens of family homesteads, their boundaries meticulously drawn, their owners' names listed. The Miller place, the Garcia farm, the Thompson Ranch. It was all there, a thriving community erased from memory. He turned the page to the 1947 ledger. He found the same section. It was almost entirely blank. In place of the dozens of small parcels, there was a single, massive entry. The neat, hand-drawn map had been replaced by a stark, typed annotation that covered 2 full pages. The land had been transferred, in its entirety, to the United States Department of the Interior. Underneath, a note. All private holdings within this sector nullified as per the Columbia Basin Reclamation Act of 1947. Nullified. A cold, bureaucratic word for annihilation. Find what you were looking for? Margaret's voice cut through the silence. John looked up. It says the holdings were nullified. What does that mean? It means the government took the land, she said, her voice flat. Eminent domain. For the expansion of the dam system and the creation of the national forest. It happened all over the state back then. What happened to the families? John asked. Margaret shrugged. A small, almost imperceptible movement of her shoulders. They were compensated. Relocated. That was the official story. The official story, John repeated, the words tasting like ash. Is there another one? Margaret walked over to the table and looked down at the ledger. She pointed a long, bony finger at the entry. My grandfather was the clerk back then. He's the one who had to stamp this page. He never liked to talk about it. Said it was a dark time. Said the compensation was a joke, and the relocations weren't always voluntary. She looked at John, her eyes holding his. He said people just disappeared. Their houses were gone overnight. The land was scraped clean. Within a year, it was like they had never been here. A silence settled between them, thick with the weight of unspoken history. Why are you really looking for this? She asked, her voice softer now. John made a decision. He had to trust someone. Because I found something, he said quietly. Something that suggests the official story isn't just incomplete. It's a lie. He didn't tell her about the yacht. It was too fantastic, too unbelievable. But he told her about the footlockers, the deeds, the $1 payments. He spoke in low, measured tones, presenting the facts as he had found them. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he was finished, she was silent for a long time. "The man you need to talk to is Elias Vance," she said finally. "He was the county surveyor for 40 years, retired now, knows more about the history of this land than anyone alive. He lives in the old schoolhouse on River Road." She scribbled the address on a slip of paper. "If anyone can make sense of what you found, it's him." "Thank you," John said. He meant it.
"Be careful," she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "There are powerful interests tied to that land. Always have been. Some stories are buried for a reason."
Elias Vance lived in a converted one-room schoolhouse that stood alone in a field of overgrown grass. Smoke curled from its crooked stone chimney. John found him in a massive workshop attached to the back, a space filled with drafting tables, antique surveying equipment, and floor-to-ceiling maps. Elias was a small, wiry man in his 80s, with a cloud of white hair and eyes that still held a mischievous spark. He was bent over a complex map, a magnifying glass in one hand and a pencil in the other. "Margaret Finch sent me," John said from the doorway. Elias looked up, his bright eyes appraising John. "Did she now? Well, either you've got a serious property dispute, or you've stumbled into some old trouble. Which is it?" "Old trouble," John said. He spent the next hour laying it all out for Elias, including the part about the ship. He expected disbelief, dismissal. Instead, Elias listened with rapt attention, his head cocked like a curious bird. When John mentioned the silver railroad spike, Elias held up a hand, his eyes wide. "A silver spike? From 1869? He asked, his voice trembling with excitement. "Are you certain?" "Yes," John confirmed. "Why? What does it mean?" Elias rushed to a tall filing cabinet and pulled out a long, rolled-up document. He spread it on a drafting table. It was a brittle, yellowed map, a railroad survey map from the 1860s. "Look here," he said, his finger tracing a faint line across the map. "This is the original proposed northern route for the Transcontinental Railroad. It was supposed to come right through this valley. The government gave the railroad company a land grant, 10 square miles of land for every mile of track they laid." He pulled out another map, a geological survey from the same era. "And look at this. They knew. Even back then, they knew." He pointed to a series of notations. Coal, copper, silver. This valley wasn't just farmland. It was sitting on a fortune in mineral rights. The railroad was never about connecting the country. It was about securing those rights. "But the railroad was never built through here," John said. "Exactly," Elias exclaimed, slapping the table. "The route was changed at the last minute, moved 100 miles south. But the railroad company never relinquished the land grant. Legally, they still owned a 10-mile-wide strip of this valley, including all the mineral rights. But their claim was complicated. There were homesteaders here first. The titles were a legal nightmare." The pieces began to click into place for John. "So in the 1940s, somebody decided to clean up the mess," Elias finished, his voice grim. "They used the Reclamation Act as a cover, wiped out the homesteaders, erased their claims, and consolidated the land. But they couldn't just take it. They had to hide the real reason. They couldn't let it be known that this was all for a private railroad company that had been defunct for 50 years. "So who owns the land now?" John asked. Elias went to another cabinet and pulled out a modern plat map. He spread it over the old ones. The single massive parcel of federal land was still there. But it had a new annotation. Leased, 99 years, commencing 1948. And the name of the lessee? Sterling Pacific Development Corporation. Sterling Pacific, Elias said, the name tasting like poison. They're the successors to the old railroad holding company. They've been sitting on this land for 70 years, waiting. They're not a development company. They're a resource extraction firm. They've been waiting for the technology to become profitable enough and for the original crime to be forgotten. Looks like they're getting ready to make their move. The name Sterling echoed in John's mind. It felt like a premonition. He now understood the full scope of the secret buried in the heart of the Serenity. It was not just the story of displaced families. It was the evidence of a massive, century-long conspiracy to steal a valley. The yacht was a witness, and he, John, was now its steward. The responsibility settled on his shoulders, heavy and undeniable. He returned to the forest, the afternoon light slanting low through the trees. He felt a sense of purpose he had not known since he had worn the uniform of his country. This was a new mission, not one of destruction, but of protection, of truth. As he approached the hidden ship, Czar met him on the trail, the dog's tail giving a slow, steady wag. John knelt and buried his face in the dog's thick fur. "We have to protect it, boy," he whispered. "We have to see this through." Czar licked his face, a rare and profound gesture of solidarity. The team was back in action. The next morning, a new sound intruded upon the forest's quiet symphony. It was the low, guttural hum of a heavy engine, distant but unmistakable. John was on his small porch, cleaning his rifle, not out of aggression but out of habit, a ritual of readiness. Czar heard it first. The dog lifted his head, his ears erect, a low growl rumbling in his chest. John stopped, listening. The sound was coming from the old, overgrown logging road at the base of the mountain, a road that was supposed to be impassable. John grabbed his binoculars and moved to the edge of the woods, concealing himself behind a thicket of salal bushes. Through the lenses he saw it. A gleaming black SUV, its tires caked with mud, was parked where the logging road met the trailhead. A man was stepping out of the driver's side. He was in his late 40s, dressed not in hiking gear, but in an expensive-looking tweed sport coat, tailored trousers, and polished leather shoes that were wholly unsuited for the terrain. He moved with an air of unhurried ownership, his eyes scanning the mountainside as if he were surveying his personal estate. The man was not alone. Another man, younger and built like a professional wrestler, got out of the passenger side. He wore a tight-fitting black polo shirt that strained against his biceps and tactical pants. He was the muscle. But it was the first man who held John's attention. He was calm, composed, and exuded an aura of effortless authority. John knew the type. He had seen them in embassies and boardrooms from Kabul to Bogota. Men who wielded power not with a weapon, but with a checkbook and a team of lawyers. The well-dressed man pulled a tablet from his jacket and studied it for a moment. He then looked up, his gaze sweeping across the slope, pausing almost exactly on John's position. It was impossible for him to see John, but the feeling of being seen was unnerving. John felt a cold prickle on the back of his neck. This was him. This had to be Sterling. He pulled back into the cover of the trees, his heart pounding a slow, steady drumbeat. They knew. Somehow they knew he was here. Or they were simply inspecting their property and he was an unexpected complication. Either way, the confrontation he had known was coming had arrived. He made his way back to the cabin, moving silently through the undergrowth.
He had to get to the yacht. He had to secure the evidence. When he reached the clearing where the Serenity lay buried, he found he was too late. The man in the tweed coat was already there, standing near the exposed hatch, his expensive shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. The younger man stood a few paces behind him, arms crossed, a silent and imposing statue. They had found it. John stepped out of the tree line, his rifle held loosely at his side, its muzzle pointed at the ground. He did not raise it. This was not a firefight. This was a different kind of battle. Czar was at his heel, the dog's body language a study in controlled aggression. A low growl was a constant, barely audible vibration in the air. The man in the coat turned, his expression not of surprise, but of mild, pleasant curiosity. He smiled, a thin, bloodless smile that did not reach his eyes. "Ah," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "The resident hermit, I presume. Arthur Sterling." He extended a hand. John did not take it. "You're on private property," John said, his voice flat. It was a weak claim, considering he was a squatter himself, but it was the only one he had. Sterling chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He withdrew his hand without a trace of offense. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. According to our records, you are the one who is trespassing. This entire mountain, all 10,000 acres of it, is the legal property of the Sterling Pacific Development Corporation." He gestured expansively, as if to encompass the entire forest. "We've been leasing it from the government for 70 years. "I know what you've been doing," John said. "I know what this is." He nodded toward the ship. Sterling's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. "An interesting bit of local folklore, isn't it? A ghost ship in the woods. We've known about it for decades, of course. A relic of a rather ambitious and misguided reclamation project after the war. We're here to finally clean it up. A bit of environmental remediation." He used words like folklore and remediation to strip the yacht of its meaning, to reduce it to a piece of trash. It was a classic tactic. Minimize, dismiss, control the narrative. "It's not a relic," John said, his voice dangerously quiet. "It's a crime scene, and it's full of evidence." For the first time, a flicker of annoyance crossed Sterling's face. "Let's not be dramatic. We're talking about ancient history, land grants, eminent domain. It was a different time, with different rules. What you're calling a crime scene, our lawyers call a legally executed and binding series of property transfers. The contents of this vessel are, at best, historical curiosities. At worst, they are out-of-context documents that would only serve to confuse the public and cast unfair aspersions on a project that will bring hundreds of jobs to this depressed region." There it was, the appeal to pragmatism, the dismissal of morality in favor of profit. John had heard this speech before, in different languages, in different countries. It was always the same. "The families you displaced might disagree with your definition of curiosities," John countered. Sterling sighed, a theatrical display of patience. "Look, mister, I'm sorry, I don't know your name." "You don't need to," John said. "All right, mister, you don't need to know my name," Sterling said, a condescending edge to his voice. "I understand you think you've stumbled onto some great injustice. It's a romantic notion. But you are a man living in a shack in the woods. I am the executive vice president of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. In the end, whose story do you think people will believe?" He took a step closer. "We are prepared to be reasonable. We will offer you a generous relocation package, a settlement, if you will, for your troubles. Enough to buy a nice piece of land somewhere else, far away from here. You can disappear back into the silence you so clearly cherish." It was a bribe, wrapped in the language of a threat. Disappear. The word hung in the air between them. It was then that Czar made his move. The dog had been silent, a coiled spring of potential energy. He now stepped forward, planting himself between John and Sterling.
He did not bark. He did not snap. He simply lifted his lip, exposing a row of long, white canine teeth. It was a silent, definitive statement. It was a judgment. The low growl in his chest deepened into a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Sterling took an involuntary step back, his composure finally cracking. The mask of civility slipped, revealing the raw fear beneath. His younger associate tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his back, where John now noticed the bulge of a holstered weapon under his shirt. "Call off your dog," Sterling snapped, his voice tight. John placed a hand on Czar's head. The dog did not relax, but the growl subsided. "He doesn't like liars," John said simply. Sterling stared at John, his eyes cold with fury. The pretense of negotiation was over. "You're making a grave mistake," he said, his voice low and venomous. "This is not your fight. You have no idea who you're dealing with. We have the law, the resources, and the will to see this through. You are nothing but a temporary obstruction." He turned on his heel, his polished shoes slipping in the mud. "You will be hearing from our lawyers." He and his bodyguard marched back toward the tree line, their angry retreat a stark contrast to their confident arrival. John watched them go, his hand still resting on Czar's head. The forest was silent once more, but the silence was now charged with imminent conflict. He was no longer just a steward of the past. He was a guardian, standing against a coming storm. The time for quiet reflection was over. The time for action had begun. The storm broke 2 days later. It was not a legal notice or a court injunction that arrived, but something far more direct. John woke to the sound of heavy machinery echoing up the valley. It was a sound that vibrated in his teeth, a brutal intrusion into the natural world. He went to his vantage point with the binoculars. On the logging road below, a small convoy was assembling. 2 large flatbed trucks, a crane, and a crew of about a dozen men in hard hats and orange vests. Sterling was there, directing the operation from the cab of his SUV. They weren't waiting for the lawyers. They were here to cut the heart out of the serenity. At the same time, the sky began to darken. The air grew heavy and humid, and the wind began to whip through the trees with a mournful howl. The weather report had predicted a major fall storm, a pineapple express that would dump inches of rain on the mountains. Sterling was trying to beat it, to get what he wanted before the mountain became impassable. John knew he couldn't stop them by force. He was one man against a dozen. But he could delay them. He could be a witness. He packed his bag, checked his rifle, and said a quiet word to Czar. "Time to go to work, buddy." They moved up the mountain, not toward the yacht, but to a position high above it, a rocky outcrop that gave him a clear view of the entire site. From here, he could document everything. The crew worked with ruthless efficiency. They used chainsaws to clear a path to the ship, the sound a sacrilegious scream in the quiet woods. Ancient trees, centuries old, fell with shuddering crashes. Within a few hours, they had exposed a long section of the yacht's hull. The crane lumbered into position, its massive arm reaching toward the sky. Their plan was clear. They were going to use a cutting torch to open the hull and remove the footlockers. They weren't trying to move the ship. They were robbing the grave. As the first drops of rain began to fall, cold and fat, John saw a smaller figure break away from the main crew. The man was carrying a coil of rope and some climbing gear. He was heading for the steep, unstable slope directly above the exposed section of the hull. John recognized him as one of the quieter members of the crew, a man with the lean, weathered look of a former soldier. He had seen him arguing with the foreman earlier, pointing up at the slope with a worried expression. The rain intensified, coming down in sheets, turning the ground to slick, treacherous mud. The wind howled, tearing at the trees. John watched through his binoculars as the lone man began setting up an anchor to rappel down the slope. He wasn't part of the cutting crew. He was being sent to check the stability of the hillside. It was a dangerous, reckless assignment in this weather. Then, it happened. A sound like a cannon shot echoed through the storm as a massive boulder, loosened by the rain, broke free from the slope. It crashed down the hillside, triggering a small landslide of mud and rock. The lone man cried out, a sound snatched away by the wind as the slide swept him off his feet. He tumbled down the slope, his body disappearing into the churning brown torrent. The slide came to rest directly against the exposed hull of the Serenity, pinning him against the cold steel. John didn't hesitate. He was moving before he had even processed the decision. He scrambled down from his perch, Czar at his heels, the rain plastering his hair to his head. He could hear shouting from the work crew below, but they were in chaos, disorganized. No one was going to help the trapped man. He reached the edge of the slide. The man was half buried in mud and debris, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. He was conscious, his face pale with shock and pain. "My leg," he gasped. "I think it's broken." John assessed the situation with the cold, practiced eye of a combat medic. The slide was unstable. The rain was making it worse. They had to get him out, now. "I'm going to get you out of there," John said, his voice calm and authoritative. "What's your name?" "David," the man rasped. "All right, David. Just stay with me." John turned to Czar. "Watch," he commanded, pointing up the slope. The dog immediately planted himself, his eyes scanning the treacherous hillside for any sign of further movement, a living, breathing early warning system. John began to dig carefully around David, using his hands and his small entrenching tool. The mud was like quicksand, sucking at him. As he worked, a memory, sharp and unwelcome, sliced through him. The smell of dust and cordite, the grinding sound of shifting rubble. The face of his partner, half buried, his leg pinned under a concrete beam. The urgent voice of his team leader in his ear. "We have the asset, Cole. We have to exfil, now. That's an order." He had looked at his partner, had seen the plea in his eyes. And he had turned away. He had chosen the mission. He had left him behind. He shook his head, forcing the memory back into its cage. Not this time. This time, he would stay. He redoubled his efforts, digging with a desperate fury. He finally uncovered David's leg. It was trapped beneath a heavy, waterlogged timber. He couldn't move it alone. "The crane!" he shouted into the wind, hoping the crew below could hear him. "We need the crane!" He saw Sterling standing by his SUV, watching, his face a mask of cold calculation. He was on a radio, but he was making no move to help. To Sterling, David was an acceptable loss, a delay to his operation. The fury that rose in John was a white-hot flame. Suddenly, Czar barked, a series of sharp, urgent alarms. John looked up. A new section of the hillside, a massive sheet of mud and rock, was beginning to give way directly above them. It was much bigger than the first slide. It would bury them both. "We have to move!" John yelled, grabbing David under the arms and pulling. David screamed in pain. The timber held his leg fast. They were out of time. In that split second, John was faced with the same choice, the same terrible calculus. Save himself, or stay with the man who was trapped. He looked at Czar. The dog was not retreating. He was standing his ground, barking defiantly at the collapsing hillside. In the dog's unwavering loyalty, John found his own resolve. He would not run. He would not leave another man behind. He braced himself over David's body, preparing to shield him from the impact, a futile but necessary gesture. But as the slide began its final,
terrifying descent, something happened. The deep, resonant boom of the crane's engine roared to life. Its massive arms swung over them, and the heavy steel hook, meant for tearing the ship apart, descended toward them. The crane operator, ignoring Sterling's frantic shouts, was coming to their rescue. The hook snagged the timber pinning David's leg, and with a groan of protesting wood, lifted it free.
John hauled David out of the mud, just as the main slide came down with a deafening roar, burying the spot where they had been moments before, under tons of rock and earth. He dragged David to the relative safety of a stand of trees. The crane operator, a heavy-set man with a grim, determined face, gave him a short, sharp nod before turning his attention back to his controls, using the crane to stabilize the rest of the slope. It was a small act of defiance, a choice for morality over orders. John knelt beside David, quickly splinting his leg with 2 sturdy branches and some cord from his pack.
"Thank you," David whispered, his teeth chattering from cold and shock. "He was going to leave me there." "I know," John said. He looked down at the scene below. Sterling was apoplectic, his face contorted with rage. His operation was in shambles. The storm, the landslide, and the quiet mutiny of one of his own men had defeated him. John had not won by fighting. He had won by staying.
By choosing to save one life, he had saved everything. He had finally answered for his past. He looked at Czar, who was now sitting beside him, panting, his coat soaked. The dog looked up at him, and in his eyes John saw not praise, but a simple, profound affirmation. This was the mission. It always had been. A sense of peace, deep and true, settled over him, washing away the grime of years of guilt. The storm still raged around them, but inside, John was finally calm. The morning after the storm was unnaturally quiet. The rain had stopped, and a weak sun was trying to break through the bruised-looking clouds. The air was washed clean, smelling of wet earth and pine. John stood on the porch of his cabin, a mug of hot coffee warming his hands, and looked out at a world transformed. The roar of the creek was louder, swollen with runoff. The forest floor was littered with fallen branches. It was a scene of chaos, but also of renewal. Down at the logging road, the scene was one of official, orderly procedure. 2 county sheriff's vehicles were parked next to a Forest Service truck. Margaret Finch was there, her tall, spare frame unmistakable even from a distance. She stood with the sheriff, pointing up the mountain, her expression grim and determined. Sterling's black SUV was gone. His crane and trucks were still there, mired in the mud, monuments to his failed ambition. John had called Margaret on a satellite phone from his pack as soon as he had gotten David stabilized. He had told her everything, his voice steady and clear. He had laid out the whole story, from the yacht to Sterling's illegal operation and reckless endangerment of his crew. David, the injured man, had corroborated his account. The quiet mutiny of the crane operator had become a full-blown rebellion. Faced with official testimony from his own men, Sterling had been stripped of his power. He had been escorted off the mountain by the sheriff's deputies, his face a mask of cold, impotent fury. The polite antagonist had finally been silenced by the simple, unadorned truth. Later that morning, another vehicle made its way slowly up the rutted track to John's cabin. It was an unfamiliar sedan, and for a moment John tensed, the old vigilance returning. But then a woman got out, and the tension in his shoulders eased. It was his sister, Sarah. He hadn't seen her in 2 years, not since he had first retreated to these mountains. She was a doctor, grounded and pragmatic, and had never understood his need for isolation, though she had respected it. She walked toward him, her sensible shoes navigating the muddy ground. Her face was etched with worry, but also with a relief that was so profound it was almost painful to see.
"I got a call from a Margaret Finch," she said, her voice quiet. "She said there was an incident, that you were involved." "I'm all right, Sarah," John said.
It felt strange to say his own name, to hear hers. They were sounds from another life. She stopped in front of him, her eyes searching his face. "Are you?" she asked. "Are you really?" She wasn't just asking about the landslide. She was asking about everything. About the years of silence, the self-imposed exile, the ghost he had been living with. John looked away, toward the lake, its surface calm and gray. He thought about the choice he had made in the storm, the simple, terrifying act of staying put. He thought about the weight that had lifted from him, a burden he had carried for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. "I think so," he said, and was surprised to find that it was the truth. "Yeah, I think I am." Sarah didn't hug him. Their family was not one for easy gestures of affection. Instead, she reached out and squeezed his arm, a brief but powerful connection. "Good," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's good to have you back, John." They spent the rest of the day in a comfortable silence, punctuated by the small, necessary tasks of life. Sarah helped him patch a leak in the cabin roof caused by a fallen branch. John cooked a simple meal of stew on the wood stove. Czar, having thoroughly vetted the new arrival and deemed her acceptable, lay by the fire, his head on his paws, emitting the occasional sigh of deep contentment. It was a scene of domesticity so normal it felt revolutionary. Before she left, as dusk was settling over the valley, Sarah handed him a small, spiral-bound notebook and a pen. "Margaret said they're going to declare the ship a historical site," she told him. "They want to preserve it, right where it is. They need a caretaker, someone to watch over it. She thought you might be the right man for the job." She tapped the notebook. "And she said they'll need an official account of what's inside, a catalog, a record of the witness." John took the notebook. The blank pages felt like a promise, a future. He was no longer a man running from the past, but a man tasked with preserving it. He had found his new post. He would not be leaving the mountain. He was staying. The authorities, led by the quiet competence of Margaret Finch and the historical passion of Elias Vance, worked to secure the future of the Serenity. The Sterling Pacific Development Corporation, faced with a mountain of legal challenges and a public relations nightmare, formally relinquished its lease on the valley. The land was officially consecrated as a state historical park, its true story finally being told. The names of the displaced families, the Millers, the Garcias, the Thompsons, were restored to the history of the region. Their descendants were sought out, and while the land could not be returned, the truth could. The footlockers, the intimate records of their lives, became the heart of a new museum exhibit in North Haven, a testament to a promise kept across 7 decades. John accepted the role of caretaker of the Serenity Valley Historical Park. It was an official title for what he was already doing. He didn't move from his cabin. It was his command post, his watchtower. His duties were simple: to walk the trails, to watch over the ship, and to ensure that the silence of the valley was never again the silence of forgetting, but the silence of peace. He filled the notebook Sarah had given him, page by page, with a meticulous catalog of the ship's contents, his handwriting as neat and precise as the captain's had been in the old logbook. It was a transfer of duty, a passing of the watch. One crisp autumn evening, a year after the storm, John stood on the exposed deck of the Serenity. The forest had already begun to reclaim the scars left by Sterling's crew. New ferns grew where the chainsaws had cut. The air was cold,
and smelled of wood smoke and coming snow. Czar sat beside him, his silver muzzle resting on John's knee. The dog was older, slower, but his eyes were still bright, still watchful. John looked out over the valley, the same valley he had come to for escape. He had sought solitude to forget a failure of loyalty.
Instead, he had found a buried secret that demanded his allegiance. He had been given a second chance, not to erase the past, but to answer for it. He had learned that true peace was not found in running, but in staying. It was not found in silence, but in listening to the stories the silence holds. The sun dipped below the western ridge, painting the clouds in hues of orange and purple. The great dark hull of the yacht seemed to settle deeper into the earth, no longer a tomb, but a foundation. It was at rest. John placed a hand on the cold steel, a silent communion with the captain and his long-kept promise. He looked down at his military watch, its hands still marching forward, still measuring time. But for the first time in a long time, he was not a prisoner of the seconds it marked. He was simply a man, in a place he now called home, with his partner at his side, watching the day come to a quiet and peaceful end.